The rain came down in gray sheets the morning they arrived, turning the volcanic soil into black mud that sucked at their wooden sandals. Aiko Tanaka stood among 18 other women on the beach of an island whose name she did not know, watching American soldiers approach through the downpour with rifles slung across their backs and expressions she could not read. The ocean behind them churned dark and restless, and she thought of her mother's kitchen in Osaka, the way steam rose from rice bowls on winter mornings, the safety of walls and familiar voices. That world felt impossibly distant now, separated not merely by miles of Pacific water but by something far more permanent, a severing of the life she had known from whatever strange purgatory awaited her here. They had been told many things during the war. The propaganda broadcasts had been specific, detailed, almost loving in their horror. American soldiers were beasts who wore human skin. They would violate Japanese women without mercy, then kill them in ways too terrible to name. Better to die by one's own hand, the broadcasts insisted, than to fall into enemy hands alive. Aiko had believed these things with the certainty of someone who had never questioned the voice of authority. And when Japan surrendered in August, when the world turned inside out and the divine emperor spoke in a voice that trembled with mortality, she had waited for the promised nightmare to begin. The transport ship that brought them here had smelled of diesel fuel and vomit. The women huddled together in the hold, speaking in whispers or not at all, their kimonos dirty and torn from weeks of displacement. Some had been nurses in field hospitals. Others had worked in factories or offices in the occupied territories. A few, like Aiko, had simply been in the wrong place when the surrender came, caught in the machinery of war's collapse. They shared the same hollow-eyed exhaustion, the same knowledge that they had become, in some fundamental way, no one's responsibility and everyone's problem. The Americans did not want them. The Japanese military had abandoned them. They existed in a liminal space between nations, between identities, waiting to discover what shape their survival would take. When the landing craft's ramp dropped and the rain struck their faces, Aiko had braced herself for rough hands, for violence delivered with the casual efficiency of soldiers who had learned to see the enemy as less than human. Instead, the tall soldier with sergeant's stripes who approached kept his hands visible and empty. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but not harsh. The words were incomprehensible. English flowed past her like water over stones, but his tone carried no threat. He gestured toward a line of canvas trucks waiting beyond the beach, their olive drab sides already streaming with rain. When one woman stumbled in the mud, he moved to catch her elbow, then stopped himself, instead calling to another soldier who brought a wooden plank to bridge the worst of the mire. This small hesitation, this moment of choosing not to touch, settled into Aiko's awareness like a stone dropped into still water. She filed it away with all the other observations she had begun collecting since the surrender, pieces of evidence that did not yet form a coherent picture. The camp sat on high ground half a mile inland, where the jungle gave way to cleared earth and neat rows of Quonset huts. Chain-link fencing defined its boundaries, topped with barbed wire that glinted dully in the gray light. Guard towers stood at each corner, American soldiers visible inside with their rifles and rain ponchos. The trucks stopped before a gate where more soldiers waited, and the women were led into a large tent that smelled of canvas and disinfectant. Inside, electric lights hung from the ceiling, a luxury Aiko had not seen in months, and the relative dryness felt like a benediction after the rain. A woman in an American uniform waited there. She wore lieutenant's bars and her dark hair was pinned back with military precision, but her face held something Aiko had not expected to see in this place: concern. The woman introduced herself through an interpreter, a slight Japanese-American man with corporal's stripes who spoke both languages with equal fluency. His name was Kenji Sato, he explained, and he would help them communicate with the Americans. The woman was Lieutenant Ruth Hale, and she would be responsible for their medical care and general welfare. "You will not be harmed here," Kenji Sato said in Japanese, his accent carrying the flat tones of California. "You are prisoners of war under the protection of the Geneva Convention. The American military has strict regulations about the treatment of female POWs. No male soldier is permitted to enter your compound without authorization. You will have female medical staff. You will receive the same rations as American personnel. The words hung in the air of the tent, so contrary to everything they had been taught that several women laughed, short, bitter sounds that held no humor. Aiko remained silent, watching Lieutenant Hale's face as Kenji spoke. The American woman's eyes moved across them, taking inventory not of bodies but of persons. And when her gaze met Aiko's, something passed between them that felt almost like recognition. Not of each other, but of a shared condition. They were both women in a world made and unmade by men, both trying to navigate the aftermath of decisions they had not made. The processing took hours. They were given medical examinations behind canvas partitions, conducted entirely by Lieutenant Hale and 2 female nurses who spoke softly and explained each procedure before touching them. They were asked their names, their ages, their places of origin. A sergeant whose nameplate read wrote everything down in careful English script, sometimes asking Kenji to repeat information when pronunciation proved difficult. This attention to detail, this insistence on recording their individual identities rather than grouping them as a nameless mass of enemy women, struck Aiko as more unsettling than reassuring. It implied they might be here long enough for such records to matter. When they asked her name, she hesitated. In Japanese custom, she should give her family name first, Tanaka Aiko. But she had heard the Americans reversed this order, placing the personal before the familial. The confusion seemed emblematic of her larger dislocation, this inability to know which world's rules applied. Finally, she said both, letting them choose what to record. Sergeant Reed wrote Aiko Tanaka in his ledger, pronouncing it carefully, attempting to honor the shape of the syllables even if his American mouth could not quite form them correctly. They were issued clothing. Simple cotton dresses in pale blue, underwear, stockings, canvas shoes that looked like they might fit if laced tightly. The dresses were plain, institutional, without the structure or elegance of proper Japanese garments. But they were clean and dry. They were given bars of soap that smelled of lye and lavender, towels that were thin but serviceable, toothbrushes and tooth powder. Each item was handed over with a kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that suggested these men and women had done this before, that there existed some vast American machinery for cataloging and caring for captured enemies. Their quarters occupied a separate compound within the larger camp, enclosed by its own fence. 6 Quonset huts arranged in 2 rows, each equipped with cots, footlockers, and kerosene lamps. A washhouse stood at one end, its interior divided into individual stalls. Again, privacy where Aiko had expected communal humiliation. A larger building served as mess hall and common area, with long tables and benches and a small kitchen staffed by American personnel. The sergeant who ran the mess, a black man with kind eyes whose name she would later learn was Davis, explained through Kenji that they would eat the same food as the American soldiers, prepared the same way. If they found the American diet difficult, he could provide rice if they wished to cook it themselves. The first meal was bewildering. Meatloaf and mashed potatoes and green beans that had been boiled to submission. White bread that felt like eating sweetened air. Coffee so strong and bitter it made her throat close. Aiko forced herself to eat, knowing she needed the strength. But the food sat heavy in her stomach, alien and comfortless. Around her, the other women picked at their plates with similar wariness, some managing a few bites, others giving up entirely. Only when Sergeant Davis brought out rice the next evening did she see anyone clean their plate, the familiar grain restoring some small connection to who they had been before. The days acquired a rhythm. They woke to the sound of reveille echoing across the camp, though no one demanded they rise at that hour. Breakfast came at 0700. They were assigned light work, laundry, mending, helping in the mess, and paid in script that could be used at the camp exchange for toiletries, writing paper, small luxuries. The Americans seemed almost embarrassed to have them there, unsure what to do with 19 Japanese women who occupied a legal category that required protection but offered no clear path toward repatriation. Sergeant Reed appeared most days, usually with Kenji in tow, checking on their welfare with a kind of earnest diligence that seemed quintessentially American to Aiko. He was perhaps 30, with sun-weathered skin and pale eyes that suggested Scandinavian ancestry. He spoke slowly when addressing them, as if volume and deliberate enunciation might bridge the language gap, and he always asked if they needed anything. Fresh water, more soap, Warmer blankets for the nights when the tropical heat broke and the temperature dropped enough to raise goosebumps. These small attentions accumulated like drops of water slowly filling a vessel, not enough to overflow into trust, but enough to suggest that trust might not be entirely foolish. It was Kenji Sato who became their primary connection to this new world. He moved between languages with fluid ease, but more importantly, he understood the cultural nuances that pure translation could not convey. When the women hesitated to ask for things directly, he explained to the Americans that in Japanese culture, such requests felt presumptuous, that they had been raised to endure rather than demand. When American soldiers grew frustrated with what they perceived as the women's passivity or inscrutability, he explained that Japanese women had been taught from childhood to make themselves small, to read situations through silence and observation rather than direct confrontation. "They think we're being deliberately difficult," Kenji told Aiko one afternoon in the mess hall, his voice pitched low. He had learned to recognize her as someone who listened carefully, who seemed to be trying to understand rather than simply endure. "The Americans. They think Japanese people are mysterious, unknowable. They don't realize we're just following different rules about what's polite, what's safe." "Are we safe here?" Aiko asked. It was the first real question she had posed to him, the first crack in her careful facade of docility. Kenji considered this, his eyes moving to the window where American guards patrolled the fence line. "Safer than you would be anywhere else right now," he said finally. "The Americans take their regulations seriously. They're terrified of incidents, of anything that might make them look like the brutal conquerors they claim they're not. So yes, you're safe, at least from them." The implied caveat hung between them. Safe from the Americans, perhaps, but not from everything. Not from the judgment of other Japanese. Not from history's verdict on women who had survived when they were meant to die. The Red Cross letters began in the third week. Lieutenant Hale brought the forms herself, pale green paper with instructions in multiple languages, explaining that they could write home, that the International Red Cross would attempt to deliver the messages to their families. The restriction was cruel in its generosity, 25 words maximum. How to distill months of trauma, an entire world's collapse, into 25 words. How to tell her mother she was alive without also admitting where she was, what had happened, how thoroughly she had failed to choose death over dishonor. Aiko spent 3 evenings composing her message, counting and recounting the characters, trying different combinations that might convey both survival and filial piety. In the end, she wrote simply that she was safe, that she was being treated well, that she hoped they were healthy, and that she would come home when circumstances allowed. She did not mention the Americans. She did not mention the camp. Let them imagine what they would. Any truth would be too complicated to fit into 25 words. Kenji began offering English lessons in the evenings, informal sessions in the mess hall where interested women could learn basic phrases. Aiko attended, drawn by something more than practical necessity. Learning English felt like learning to decode the people who held power over her fate. The language was strange in her mouth, all hard consonants and flat vowels, but Kenji proved to be a patient teacher. He wrote simple words on a chalkboard liberated from some military supply depot. Hello, thank you, please, water, food, help. The women practiced in tentative voices, their accents thick and uncertain. Some of the younger American soldiers would stop by the fence sometimes in the early evening, drawn by curiosity or boredom, and call out friendly greetings that the women had learned to recognize. "Hey!" they would shout. "How are you doing?" And occasionally, one of the women would call back, "Hello, thank you." And the soldiers would grin as if they had accomplished something meaningful. But there were strict rules about these interactions. Sergeant Reed had made it clear from the beginning that no male soldier was to approach the fence for longer than a casual greeting, that anything resembling prolonged conversation was forbidden, and that any soldier who touched a female POW would face court-martial. Aiko witnessed this enforcement herself one evening when a young private with red hair and a friendly face approached the fence with what looked like candy bars in his hands, intending to share them. Before he could speak, Sergeant Reed appeared from somewhere in the gathering dusk and intercepted him with a few sharp words. The private retreated immediately, looking embarrassed, and Reed turned to the women watching through the chain link and offered a small, apologetic nod, as if to say, I know this seems harsh, but it's for everyone's protection. The incident lodged in Aiko's mind. Reed had not been angry exactly. He had been firm, but his firmness seemed directed at maintaining a boundary he believed was important. He had looked at the women not with suspicion but with something that might have been respect, acknowledging that they deserved protection from even well-meaning intrusions. It was so different from what she had expected, from the propaganda's promise of violation, that it created a kind of cognitive dissonance she struggled to resolve. Then came the leaflets. They appeared one morning scattered near the fence line, crude sheets of paper printed in Japanese and clearly smuggled from somewhere else in the camp. Aiko found one caught in the wire, the paper already damp with dew, and read it with growing dread. The message was simple and devastating. The Americans were lying. They claimed to respect the women, but this was merely a facade. At night, after the lights went out, American soldiers came to the women's compound. The women were forced to service them, threatened with violence if they refused, then silenced with promises of better treatment. The whole operation was an elaborate deception, designed to lull the outside world into believing the Americans were civilized while they committed unspeakable acts under cover of darkness. None of it was true. Aiko knew this with absolute certainty because she had lived every night in this camp, had listened to the sounds of her fellow prisoners sleeping or weeping quietly, had never once heard the intrusion of male footsteps in the darkness. But the leaflet's existence meant someone believed these lies, or wanted others to believe them. And that someone was almost certainly in the male Japanese POW compound that occupied another section of the camp, separated from the women by several hundred yards and multiple fences but close enough that rumors could travel, that resentment could fester. Lieutenant Hale called an emergency meeting that afternoon, her face tight with anger. Through Kenji, she explained that these leaflets were propaganda, that the American command was investigating their source, and that every claim they made was categorically false. "You know what happens here," she said, her eyes moving across the assembled women. "You live this reality every day. Don't let anyone's lies steal your truth." But truth, Aiko was learning, was a more complicated thing than simple facts. The truth was that the Americans had treated them with scrupulous correctness. The truth was also that she was a Japanese woman in an enemy camp, that her presence here at all represented a kind of dishonor that could never be fully washed away, and that somewhere in this camp were Japanese men. Possibly soldiers who had fought until surrender, men who had sacrificed everything for the emperor, who now had to reconcile their continued existence with the knowledge that Japanese women were living under American protection, eating American food, learning American words. The rage that must generate, the shame and resentment, the need to restore some sense of masculine honor by casting the women as victims or collaborators or both. Aiko understood this psychology even as it terrified her. The tension in the camp shifted after the leaflets appeared. The American guards increased their patrols. The casual evening greetings from soldiers stopped entirely, as if the command had instituted an even stricter interpretation of the fraternization rules. Aiko noticed Sergeant Reed walking the fence line more frequently, his expression troubled, as if the mere existence of the accusations had somehow tainted what he had been trying to accomplish here. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, this complication of cross-cutting loyalties and cultural shame. But she lacked the English words, and more fundamentally, she wasn't certain it would help. Americans, she was beginning to understand, had their own complicated relationship with honor and duty. They seemed genuinely disturbed by the idea that anyone might think them capable of the behavior described in the leaflets. Their innocence of the charges felt almost like a source of pain, as if being falsely accused was nearly as distressing as actually being guilty would be. More leaflets appeared over the following weeks, each version more detailed and vicious than the last. They claimed that the women had been given alcohol and forced to dance for American officers. They claimed that pregnancies were being terminated in secret. They claimed that several women had attempted suicide out of shame and their deaths had been covered up. Each accusation was a deliberate fiction, but their cumulative effect was to create an alternate narrative of the camp's reality, a counter-truth that people who had never been inside these fences might find more credible than the boring reality of bureaucratic correctness and institutional caution. The breaking point came in late October. A delegation of Japanese officers from the male POW compound requested a formal meeting with the American command to discuss the treatment of the female prisoners. The request was granted, and on a cool morning with high clouds streaming overhead, 3 Japanese officers were escorted into an administrative building for what Aiko later learned was a tense, 2-hour conference. The ranking officer was a Lieutenant Nakamura, a compact man in his 40s with eyes that held the particular hardness of someone who had survived but not surrendered in spirit. Through interpreters, he demanded proof that the women were being treated in accordance with international law. He asked for documentation of their medical care, their rations, their wages. He asked to see their living quarters. And he asked point-blank whether any American soldier had been disciplined for misconduct involving the female prisoners. The American commander, a colonel whose patience was clearly wearing thin, provided all the documentation requested. He arranged for a supervised tour of the women's compound, with Lieutenant Nakamura and his fellow officers allowed to observe from a distance while the women went about their daily routines. He produced medical records, wage ledgers, incident reports showing 0 complaints of abuse. And when Lieutenant Nakamura persisted, suggesting that the women might be too frightened to speak truthfully, the colonel made an offer that would change everything. "Let them speak for themselves," he said through the interpreter. "Not in private, where they might be coerced. In public, in front of both American and Japanese witnesses. Let your own people hear directly from the women what their experience has been. No prepared statements, just questions and honest answers." It was Kenji who brought this proposal to them that evening, gathering all 19 women in the mess hall and explaining what the Americans wanted to do. His face was troubled as he spoke, as if he understood the impossible position this put them in. "You're not required to participate," he said carefully. "The Americans will respect your decision either way. But if you choose to speak, you'll have the opportunity to counter these lies directly. To tell the truth about what's happened here." Silence filled the room. Aiko felt the weight of decision pressing down on her shoulders, felt the eyes of the other women seeking direction or reassurance or permission. To speak would be to break the expectation of silence that had governed their entire lives. To speak would be to claim their own experience as valid, as worthy of belief. But to speak would also be to contradict other Japanese, to side with the Americans in a dispute that carried implications far beyond this camp. It would be seen as collaboration, as choosing the enemy over their own people. The debate stretched across 3 days. Some women adamantly refused to participate, arguing that any public statement would be used as propaganda by the Americans, that their words would be twisted to serve their captors' purposes. Others felt that silence would allow the lies to stand unchallenged, that their refusal to speak would be interpreted as confirmation of the Leaflets' accusations. Aiko listened to both sides, her own mind churning through the implications, and found herself thinking about her music box. It had been a gift from her father years ago when she was a child. A small lacquered box that played a French waltz when opened, an extravagant present from a man who rarely showed affection except through such gestures. She had carried it with her through the chaos of the war's end, one of the few personal possessions she had managed to keep. 2 weeks ago it had broken. The delicate mechanism simply ceased to work, probably from moisture or rough handling during transport. She had taken it to Sergeant Reed, not expecting help, but hoping he might know if the camp had anyone who could repair such things. He had examined it carefully, asked Kenji to explain its significance, then disappeared for 2 days. When he returned, the music box worked. He had found a Navy technician who tinkered with small mechanisms as a hobby, convinced the man to take a look, and personally supervised the repair. He returned it to her wrapped in clean cloth, handled it like it was something precious, and refused her offer to pay from her camp scrip. "It's important to you," he had said through Kenji. "That makes it worth fixing." This memory crystallized something for Aiko. The Americans had made promises about how they would treat the prisoners. They had said there would be rules, protections, dignity. And in every instance she had witnessed, they had kept those promises. They had not touched the women. They had provided female medical care. They had paid wages, allowed Red Cross letters, turned away soldiers who approached the fence with good intentions but bad judgment. They had repaired a broken music box because it mattered to someone who had almost nothing left in the world. She made her decision. The assembly was scheduled for November 15th, on a concrete pad normally used for vehicle maintenance. chosen because it was large enough to accommodate witnesses but still within the secure perimeter of the camp. Rows of folding chairs were arranged facing a simple wooden podium with a microphone. On one side, American officers and enlisted personnel would observe. On the other, a delegation of Japanese POWs, limited to 20 men by security concerns, would represent what the Americans were calling the Japanese perspective. Between them, an empty no-man's land of 10 feet that felt like miles. Aiko woke that morning with her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. She dressed in her blue institutional dress, pinned her hair back with the careful precision her mother had taught her, and tried to eat breakfast though her stomach rebelled. Around her, the 6 other women who had agreed to speak made similar preparations, their faces reflecting the same mixture of determination and terror. They had decided that Aiko would speak first, partly because she had volunteered, but mostly because she was 26 years old, not too young to be dismissed as naive but not old enough to be written off as too traditional to understand the modern world. She would set the tone. If she succeeded, others might follow. If she failed, the entire project might collapse into silence. The morning was crystalline and bright, the kind of Pacific day that made you understand why men had fought so desperately for these islands. Aiko walked with the others across the compound, flanked by Lieutenant Hale and Kenji Sato, her legs feeling disconnected from her body. She could see the assembled crowd already, the American side's rows of clean uniforms and curious faces, the Japanese side's smaller delegation sitting rigid and formal, their expressions unreadable at this distance. As they approached, she could make out Lieutenant Nakamura in the front row of the Japanese section, his face set in lines of skeptical judgment. He looked like he had already decided what he would hear, what story these women would tell if they had been properly threatened or seduced by their captors. The challenge would be to speak not to his certainty, but to whatever doubt might exist in the minds behind him. The American colonel opened the proceedings with a brief statement, translated by Kenji into Japanese. He explained that this assembly had been requested by representatives of the male Japanese POWs, that the purpose was to allow the female prisoners to describe their treatment in their own words, and that no one would be compelled to speak or punished for what they said. He then invited the first witness to approach the podium. Aiko stood, her legs somehow carrying her forward. The microphone stood at shoulder height, alien and technological, a device that would amplify her voice across this assembly and, she suddenly realized, probably into a recording device that would preserve her words indefinitely. She gripped the edges of the podium to stop her hands from shaking. "My name is Tanaka Aiko," she began in Japanese, and Kenji's English translation followed a beat behind her words, creating an odd echo effect. "I am from Osaka. I am 26 years old. I was a secretary in the administration office of a textile factory before the war." She paused, gathering her courage. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant Nakamura leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on her face. "I was told many things before I came to this camp," she continued. "I was told that American soldiers were animals, that they would violate Japanese women without hesitation, that death was preferable to capture. I believed these things. When I arrived here in September, I expected the worst." Another pause. The assembly was perfectly silent, hundreds of people holding their breath. "I have been here for 2 months. In that time, no American soldier has touched me. Not once. Not my arm. Not my hand. Not any part of my body." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the truth of the words granting them weight. "When I was sick in the first week, I was examined by a woman doctor, Lieutenant Hale, who is sitting here. When American soldiers walk past our fence, they are forbidden from stopping to talk to us. I have seen soldiers disciplined for approaching too close. I have seen Sergeant Reed turn away men who wanted to give us gifts, because the rules say they cannot." She looked directly at Lieutenant Nakamura now, willing him to hear her. "We are paid for our work. In American money. We can use it to buy things at the camp exchange. We are given the same food as American soldiers. We attend English lessons because we choose to, not because we are forced. We have sent letters home through the Red Cross. We have been given soap and clean clothing and private washing facilities. We have been treated not as enemies, but as people who deserve dignity." A murmur ran through the Japanese delegation. Lieutenant Nakamura's face had gone hard. His jaw clenched. "I know what you think," Aiko said, her voice dropping lower, more intimate. "You think we are collaborators. You think we have betrayed our country by accepting this treatment, by not choosing death. You think we have been dishonored by our survival. But I am telling you the truth. The Americans have rules and they have followed them. Every day. Without exception." She felt tears gathering but refused to let them fall. "I do not know what will happen to us. I do not know when we will go home, or if anyone will want us when we return. But while I am here, I will not let lies stand unchallenged. I will not let anyone say that we have been abused when we have not. I will not let the Americans who have kept their promises be accused of crimes they have not committed." Her hands were shaking again. She gripped the podium harder. "My father gave me a music box when I was young. It broke here in this camp. I thought it was lost forever. But Sergeant Reed found someone to repair it and brought it back to me. He did not have to do that. It served no strategic purpose. It was simply an act of kindness toward someone he had no reason to be kind to. That is the truth of this place. That is what I have seen with my own eyes." She stepped back from the microphone, her entire body trembling now with released tension. Kenji translated her final words into English, and she heard something unexpected from the American side of the assembly. Applause. Not loud, not inappropriate, but a quiet acknowledgement that rippled through their ranks. On the Japanese side, Lieutenant Nakamura sat frozen, his face a mask. But behind him, she saw some of the other men exchanging glances, their certainty perhaps not as complete as it had been 10 minutes ago. 6 more women spoke that morning, each adding their own testimony, their own specific observations. They spoke of medical care and privacy. They spoke of being addressed by name. They spoke of small kindnesses and strict boundaries. They spoke of learning English words and sending letters home. They spoke of meals shared with dignity and wages paid fairly. They spoke, simply and without embellishment, of a reality that contradicted everything the propaganda had promised. When the assembly ended 2 hours later, nothing was resolved in any final sense. Lieutenant Nakamura and his delegation retreated to their compound without comment, their expressions unreadable. The American colonel thanked the women formally, promising that their testimony had been recorded and would be preserved in official documents. The women returned to their compound drained and uncertain, knowing they had crossed some threshold from which there would be no return. That evening, Aiko sat on her cot holding her repaired music box, turning it over in her hands. She opened the lid, and the French waltz began to play, tinny and sweet in the gathering darkness. Around her, the other women prepared for sleep, their quiet conversations and small movements creating the ordinary sounds of survival. Outside, she could hear American guards making their rounds, their footsteps regular and reassuring. Further away, the ocean breathed against the shore, eternal and indifferent to the small dramas of human conscience being worked out on this volcanic rock. She did not know if her testimony would change anything. She did not know if the lies would stop, or if the Japanese men in their compound would ever believe that Japanese women could be treated with dignity by their enemies. She did not know what would happen when she finally went home, whether her family would welcome her or turn away in shame, whether Japan would have any place for women who had survived in the wrong way. But she knew what she had done today. She had spoken truth in a world built on lies. She had claimed her own experience as valid. She had refused to let shame silence her. And perhaps that was all anyone could do in the aftermath of war, to insist on the small, fragile truths that survived when grand narratives collapsed. To remember the music box repaired, the boundaries honored, the promises kept. To carry those memories forward into whatever future awaited, proof that even in humanity's darkest hours, there were those who chose, however imperfectly, to reach across the divide and recognize the person standing on the other side. The music box played its waltz to the end, then fell silent. Aiko closed the lid gently and placed it in her footlocker. Tomorrow would bring new complications, new tensions, new evidence that the war's end had not healed its wounds. But tonight, she allowed herself to rest in the knowledge that she had told her truth, and that truth had been heard. In a world where so many voices had been silenced, where so many stories had been erased, that small victory felt like enough.